Okay, I'm going to give you two choices. Who would like to hear the depressing version of today's talk? Okay, who wants to hear the really depressing version of today's talk? Yes, this is Public Opinion for Libertarians, so we're leaning a little bit towards merely depressing, so I'll stick with that. All right, so libertarian professors, policy analysts, journalists, and bloggers all try to move public opinion in a libertarian direction. Right, this is what all of these people do. That is what they think about themselves as doing. Right, if any of these occupations are of interest to you, or if that you may already be practicing some of them, this is probably what you have in mind when you get to work. I am here to move public opinion one person at a time. Okay? And why in the world would you bother trying to change public opinion? Well, the implicit theory is one that libertarians quote very frequently. The quote is, ideas have consequences. If we can get a bunch of people to agree with us, then what we want to happen will happen. And this is consistent with the most basic model of political economy, which is known as the median voter model. How many people have seen the median voter model at some point? Okay, good. It's a very intuitive story. It says that if you have two politicians that are competing for the public's affection on the basis of a single issue, then if a politician wants to get more votes, he moves to the center. And if both politicians want to get more votes, they both move to the center. And when do they stop moving to the center? Or when do they both stop moving? When they both hit the center. And mathematically, the center of the distribution that matters is the median, right? Because remember, the median is the position such that 50% of people want more, 50% want less. Right? So I'm not going to go over the model in any detail, but it's a very intuitive model. It basically says that, look, if you're a politician, you want people to like you, you need to move to the center. And since all politicians who are competing want voters to like them, they will all move to the center, and therefore what the median person wants to happen is in fact what tends to happen. Right? This is what the model says. Many libertarians go on to say, no, this model is actually wrong. There's special interests that are corrupting the whole process. Although when you think about it, if special interests are really corrupting the whole process, then why are you focusing so much on public opinion? So we'll come back to that. The answer that I'm going to give you is actually the special interests are largely a sideshow, and public opinion is the right thing to be focused on. Okay. So in any case, given the very prominent role among libertarian professionals of public opinion, it seems like a good idea to figure out where public opinion currently stands. Right? There are many people whose job it is to sway public opinion that I've talked to who appear to know next to nothing about public opinion, which is odd, right? You think if you're trying to influence it, you might want to know where it is. Right? Then you could know how hard is this going to be, where can I realistically move it to, and so on. Okay, so for example, I've talked to many economists who ought to know better, who say things like, well, the only reason we have Social Security is because retirees vote in such large percentages. And I just want to say, do you know any normal people at all? Because if you did, you would realize that virtually the only people, old or young, who oppose Social Security are libertarians and free market economists. Everybody else thinks it's a great idea. It doesn't matter whether they're old or young. It's got nothing to do with that. Right? And yet they will say this to other people who you think would know this, but it seems like they don't. Right? It seems like they don't. So this is just one example. Another one that I see from economists all the time is, well, how in the world can public opinion explain farm subsidies? Well, let's take a look at public opinion on farm subsidies. There's data. And the data is that about 80% of Americans favor farm subsidies, and the percentage that favor farm subsidies is very similar in farm and non-farm states. And then the economists squint at me and they say, how is that possible? Well, you can go to the survey and you can find out some common reasons why people who aren't farmers and don't live in farm states would support farm subsidies. Like one argument that 60% of Americans agree with is you need farm subsidies to ensure an adequate supply of food. All right. It's not about helping farmers. For most people, it's about making sure we don't starve. Right? That's why we need the program. And yet, many economists will talk about the existence of farm subsidies as if this data on public opinion didn't exist. And as if they hadn't ever talked to normal people and noticed that normal people are not vehemently opposed to farm subsidies, not even mildly opposed to them. Okay, so if you want to move public opinion, it is good to learn where public opinion stands. And that is what I'm going to try to do on today's Whirlwind Tour. Can't cover everything, but in the Q&A, I will try to answer all questions. And I have spent lots of hours just going through surveys, looking at questions, looking at patterns, and trying to remember as much as I can, because it is a huge field. But on the other hand, it is very easy to learn, If any of you have internet connections, you could be learning right now as we speak. You can just Google General Social Survey and start looking at questions and noticing, wow, so that's what it's like. Okay, now as soon as you bring up surveys, there are many people, especially economists, who will go and say, you can't trust surveys. People might lie on surveys. Okay, it's true they might lie on surveys, but just calm down for a moment. First of all, do you know where the numbers that you actually say that you can trust come from? For example, unemployment rates, where do those come from? Yeah, do we hire private detectives to follow people around to see whether or not they're working or not? No, we phone call people. We call people on the phone and we ask them, are you working or not? And we write down their answer and we report that as the truth. Right? Is it possible that could have some problems? Sure, like maybe people would be embarrassed to say they're unemployed. Right? And yet we use them and generally don't complain. And if someone points out these problems for the accepted kinds of surveys, economists will say, well, of course, there's always some problems, but it's the best we can do, and if you've got some specific fix, let's try that, but otherwise stop just making general complaints. Okay. And this is what I'll say for surveys in general. There are many terrible surveys that have been done, but the solution is not to say we will never do surveys. The solution is better surveys and some common sense. Okay, so while surveys are never perfect, nationally representative surveys are far superior to the alternative, which is usually to ask yourself, what do the people I know think? And then assume everyone in the world is like you and your friends. That is a terrible approach. There's a famous quote that supposedly comes from the 1972 Nixon-McGovern election. When I was trying to verify this quote on Google, turns out it's actually kind of complicated as to who really said it and whether they said exactly this quote. But I'm sure somebody said it, and a lot of people were thinking it. And the quote is roughly this. There must have been electoral fraud. Nixon couldn't possibly have won. Why? Because no one I know voted for him. Well, maybe that shows that there was massive electoral fraud. On the other hand, perhaps it shows that people who think the same way about politics hang out together, talk amongst themselves, and then imagine that they are the world. And they're not. Right? So, and the weirder you are, right, and if you're in this room, you probably are, according to many people, fairly weird. The weirder you are, the more important it is to not rely upon intuition or introspection, but rather to go and turn to nationally representative surveys. We can find out what happens when you ask the kinds of people that you don't want to be friends with. Right? What happens when you find out what their opinions are? What about the people that you would never meet? Right? So even if you wanted to make a bunch of friends who had dropped out of high school, where would you start? Right? People in this room would just like, well, do I know anyone who dropped out of high school? Maybe a few, but I don't really want to be their friends, so... it's on you. You probably are so limited in the people that you know that it's just hard even to expand your horizons very much by firsthand experience. But fortunately, there are surveys out there to assist us. Okay, so just one other example of a terrible survey. When I was an undergraduate, I got a survey in the mail on marijuana legalization, sponsored by NORML, a national organization for the pro-marijuana laws. And as far as I can tell, they had bought the mailing list of Critical Review, which, as you don't know, is a libertarian academic journal. And then, as far as I can tell, they were planning on taking responses of people like me and reporting them as what Americans think, which is absurd. Yes, well, it turns out that 98% of Americans want to legalize marijuana. That is an example of a very poorly run survey. Now, if you're thinking about it, you realize some people might want poorly run surveys. If all you're looking for is to get some media attention where you go and say, look, Americans agree with us, here's a survey showing that they do, that's all you're looking for, then the crummy survey may be the better survey for your approach. However, if you want truth, then that is not the way to go. Okay. Now, responses are definitely sensitive to question wordings. This is very well known, but trying to phrase questions neutrally pays off. So you don't go do a survey about abortion where you ask people, are you pro-life or pro-death? That's not a very good survey. Right? And you also don't want to do, are you pro-choice or anti-choice? Right? These are ways where you're wording the question in such a way to try to nudge people in the direction of the answer that you want. Right? And again, if you're just looking for advocacy numbers, that's okay. Not that I would encourage. Well, not really okay. It is useful. Perhaps useful. Not okay. It's wrong. Right? Do honest work, please. Okay, but yes. Okay, so trying to phrase questions neutrally, does pay off in terms of learning about what's really going on. So, here's an example of a question that I would say is quite good. Quote, if the government had a choice between reducing taxes or spending more on social programs like healthcare, Social Security, and unemployment benefits, which do you think it should do? Here's something where you give people two options, both worded in ways that advocates of the position could agree with the way that you worded it and embrace it. And at the same time, you also give people the main argument that people who advocate that view would accept. Okay, so when you ask that question that way, you get a split 40-60 with 60 in favor of more spending. That's one example. Not to say that you could not improve that question, but that's an example of a question where I'd say the person who wrote this question was trying. The person was trying to write a question where they were trying to get at people's actual opinions, not the opinions that you nudged or embarrassed them for the purpose of being able to say that a lot of people agree with you. Now, it's also worth pointing out that there are many views that are so solid in the public that even when you ask the question in a very biased way, you cannot change their minds. So, for example, there's a question that's been asked about support for Social Security. An experiment was done where some people who were young were asked, first, do you believe that you'll ever personally collect Social Security benefits? And then later in the survey, do you favor the Social Security program? Other people were asked the question in the opposite order. Right? And it turned out that support for Social Security was almost invariant to the way people were asked. And yes, about 80% of young people said they did not expect to collect benefits. But after saying that they did not expect to collect benefits, they still said they supported the program. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that is so popular that even after you bring it to the forefront of a person's mind that they are going to get the short end of the stick, they don't change their minds. And there's plenty of other questions like that. Okay, all right. Now, from a libertarian point of view, what can we say about public opinion? Here I'm going to be focusing on the United States, which is the data that I know best, and then also it is the data that is just simply most abundant. But we can talk about other questions or other countries, or of course, if you know something about other countries and you think would be relevant, feel free to share. Okay, so for abstract questions, Americans lean in a libertarian direction in some important areas. Right? You said you just wanted the depressing version, not the really depressing version. Okay, so in some important areas on abstract questions, Americans do lean in a libertarian direction. For example, in the General Social Survey, which is one of the most amazing surveys known to man, maybe the most amazing one known to man. There's a tough contest, but here you have questions that have been asked for about 40 years on almost any topic you can think of. Almost any topic you can think of, people have been asked. Right? Sometimes they've been asked for decades. Okay? So they don't ask every question every year. Okay, so in the General Social Survey, there have been questions about public opinion on spending for a very long time, basically for the whole history of the survey. And about 75% of Americans favor or strongly favor cuts in government spending. Okay, so yay, liberty. Okay, so when you just ask it that way, should government spending be increased, be reduced, or stay the same? 75% of Americans will say that spending should be reduced. We are almost 75%. Okay. Incidentally, it is not actually that different even in countries like Sweden. Even in countries like Sweden, there is strong support for lowering spending in general. Okay, so this should, of course, lead you to be somewhat suspicious. Okay, and yes. Okay, now another example, how about civil liberties? Well, there's the 2007 State of the First Amendment survey. In this survey, which, again, based upon the group is running it is a pro-civil liberties organization. So my initial concern was maybe the survey is advocacy, but reading through it, it seemed to me the questions were very fairly worded overall, and so I'm happy to share it with you. But again, so always good to ask yourself where did the survey come from and what questions did they ask exactly. Okay, so in the survey, 98% of Americans. Right, and that number alone should surprise you because 98% of Americans don't agree on almost anything. And, there's always 1 or 2% in favor of almost anything. So, there's a lot of sick people out there. See the internet. Okay, so 98% said that, quote, the right to speak freely about whatever you want, end quote, was essential or important. Okay, so far, things are not looking bad. I'm not telling you about a lot of other abstract questions where the answers were much less libertarian, but here I want to go and point to the libertarian highlights of public opinion. Okay, there are examples where the public is, on these abstract questions, seemingly quite libertarian. And from the point of view of the median voter theorem, you look at that 75% wants to have less spending, and then you say, aha, democracy is not working. Right? If politicians were actually competing with each other as the median voter says they would, then candidates on both parties would be very strongly campaigning in favor of lower spending, and not only would they campaign in favor of it, but they would do it. And then government would be smaller. And once government got a lot smaller, then the public would stop saying that we should have less spending. Right? That's the idea of the median voter theorem. Okay. So now that you have a small glimmer of hope, I will now take much of it away from you. All right. First of all, the more specific the question, the less libertarian the answer. This is almost a universal rule. Almost a universal rule that when you move away from very abstract questions about mom, apple pie, and liberty, and move to specific questions about should people be able to do this exact thing, you see that much libertarian sentiment quickly evaporates. Okay, so as I said, in the General Social Survey, support for cutting spending in general, supermajority wants to do it. But then break it down by category. If you break it down by category, there is almost no category that people don't want to spend more on. Health, education, the environment. Go down the list of all the major areas of government spending. There are virtually none where the public wants to cut them. The only kind of spending that the public consistently wishes to cut is foreign aid. Right? And you might actually recall that in the 2008 campaign, Biden was asked by a journalist, said, look, you said that you want to increase those spending in a lot of areas, but you also don't want to increase the deficit or increase taxes, so how are you going to make up the difference? And then Biden gave his best serious face. So I thought about this very long and hard, and I'm afraid we're going to have to cut foreign aid spending. And if you know the actual percentage of the budget that goes to foreign aid, this was about a serious answer saying we are going to have to cut chewing gum spending. We're no longer be able to allow our proud soldiers to have an unlimited supply of chewing gum. That is the way that we're going to fund health care. Okay, it is a ridiculous answer, but this is the only kind of spending that the public consistently wants to cut. What about welfare? Welfare is an interesting case because there are some years when the median person says that we should actually spend less on welfare. However, two things to consider. First of all, if you change the way you word the question, it matters. Welfare is much less popular than spending on the poor. Okay, so if you say, should we spend less on the poor, you're less likely to get people saying yes than if you say, should we spend money on welfare? Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind is it really is a matter of the label to a significant degree. Now, the much more depressing fact is that there's an excellent survey done by the Kaiser Family Foundation around the time of welfare reform where they probed more deeply into the public's views on welfare. And the most interesting question to me was this. They went and gave a hypothetical that is perfectly reasonable. It says, look, suppose that a person who was previously on welfare runs out of time, right? So they reach the end of the period where they're allowed to collect benefits, and then they have difficulty finding a well-paying job that would allow them to support a family. Then what should we do? Okay, and only 25% said they should just have to take a low-paying job. Which, if you think about it, if former welfare recipients should not be doing low-skilled jobs, who should be doing low-skilled jobs? They are inexperienced. They probably have very low skills, so you would think that the natural place for them to start would be in low-skilled jobs and then begin to work their way up. And yet, only a very tiny, hard-hearted minority was willing to say that after your benefits run out, then you should simply be expected to take a job that is low-paying. So what do Americans think should be done when people run out of when their welfare benefits expire and they aren't earning a high salary or even a middle-class salary? Job training. They think that we should give them job training until they're able to be middle class. Right now, if you know anything about the actual empirics of job training programs, the absolute best case scenario for government job training programs is that they have the standard rate of return to education, which is a year will raise your income by maybe 6 to 8%. So if someone is starting out where their market wage is minimum wage, how many years would it take of job training to get them up in the best case scenario up to middle class income? Did you have like 10 years of job training? Okay, so essentially, when you really look at American public opinion on welfare, compared to the realistic alternatives, the median voter probably does support what we have. Essentially, if they had the option of we'll give everybody 6 months of job training and then they'll be middle class, they'd like that better, but that is not actually possible to do. Okay. All right. So the public favors increasing spending in almost all categories. Like I said, foreign aid being the one clear exception, welfare being an ambiguous exception. There are other spending areas like defense that in a sense are unpopular, but the median voter still favors the status quo. So it is common for defense spending that you'll see 20% says we need more, 40% says we need the status quo, 40% says we need less. But if you remember the basic mathematics of medians, so 20% say more, 40% say the status quo, 20% say less. Where's the median? Where does the median lie? At the status quo, right? Because the median is the position where 50% want more, 50% want less. Okay, so since 40 percentage points in the middle favor the status quo, the median is the status quo. So that would be an example of spending that, in a sense, is unpopular, but it's not unpopular in a way that contradicts the median voter theorem. Okay, right? And of course, there are many other kinds of spending where where it's reversed, where you may have like 40% say more, 40% say same, only 20% say less. And then finally, just to make sure I'm depressing you adequately, if anything, there's a tendency for government to be smaller than people say they want. There are a number of spending categories where Americans almost always say that we should have more spending. Right? And where are these? These are your goody-goody categories in the Holy Trinity, as I described them. So things like health, education, and the environment. Right? Most Americans think that we should spend more on those in at least most years, again, with some slight sensitivity to how you ask the question, but not that much. Why not that much? Because people love these things. They're good. Therefore, we should have more, always. And of course, if you apply that logic in your own life, say, look, it's weekends are good. Therefore, we should always have more. Right? Therefore, I'm not ever working again. Let's see. In your own life, the distinction between something is good and it is something that I want more of is very clear. But in politics, not so much. Okay, moving on to civil liberties. So in this SFAS, the question that was asked to test how much do people really believe that you should be able to speak freely about whatever you want, the question was, quote, people should be allowed to say things in public that might be offensive to racial groups. Not even that clearly are very offensive, but might be. Right? What might be offensive? Wow, almost anything might be offensive. All right, so 44% strongly disagreed that people should be allowed to say these things in public. And the median person actually said that you should not be able to say them. Okay. So this is probably the touchiest issue in modern times, but it's striking because so many national debates revolve around issues of race, and one of the most natural things to call someone if you are unhappy with their views is to say they're racist. So, for example, a number of times I have heard the view that we should have smaller government. That is inherently racist. Okay? So, is this something that might offend racial groups to say that we should cut welfare? Maybe. So at least when you get more specific, support definitely does start to decline, right? And on many other civil liberties issues as well. Okay. All right. So let's see. I guess I'll hold questions until afterwards. But if there's any particular part of the lecture that you want to come back to, let's do that in the Q&A. Okay. So specific questions, you generally get less libertarian answers. One book that makes this mistake of confusing abstract and concrete is by Arthur Brooks, who's president of the American Enterprise Institute. You might have heard about his new book, The Battle. Okay, so before it came out, I actually had lunch with him where I told him about this, but I apparently did not persuade him. He thanks me in the acknowledgments, but didn't change his mind. So I guess that's better than what you can usually expect. All right, so in The Battle, he uses a number of very abstract questions to argue that most Americans are pro-free enterprise and yet are not getting what they want. So a number of questions showing that given a choice between do you favor free enterprise or government control, that 70% of Americans will say they favor free enterprise. First of all, I'd say that's probably not the most neutral way to word the question. Right? Probably most fans of Obama did not say, what do we want? Government control. That is the official description of our desire. Government control to the barricade. That isn't what they will say they want, so it doesn't seem like a very fair way of wording it to begin with. Right? But in any case, it's very abstract, and when you turn to more specific questions like should government do something about insurance companies not wanting to sell insurance policies to people who are already sick or wanting to charge them higher rates because they're already sick, that you get a very different attitude. The evil insurance companies, good sick people who by some strange happenstance didn't have insurance until they got very sick, and government should do something about it. And that is just one example of the way that people generally think about government policy, is when you start asking about some specific program, they become much more sympathetic. Okay. Now, when you start looking at support for libertarian reforms, this is where the things get very depressing. Even if you limit yourself to looking at moderate reforms, at moderate libertarian reforms, public opinion is generally very strongly against. Public opinion is very strongly against moderate libertarian reforms. And that, of course, means that they would love radical reforms, right? Because they just don't like half measures. That's the problem. All right. No, probably not. Now, here I will say I have to go a little bit beyond the data, because when a view is radical enough, no one bothers asking the public what it thinks about it. As far as I know, there's never been a survey on should we switch to anarcho-capitalism, right? Gallup has not bothered running the survey yet. So you might say, you have no definitive proof that most people are not anarcho-capitalists. All right, fine, I don't have any definitive proof, but it would be odd if supermajorities favor increasing government spending on healthcare and the environment and so many other areas, and yet they're also anarcho-capitalists who just feel frustrated, and so, right, so again, you can tell a story, but hard to tell the story with a straight face. Okay, so support for even moderate libertarian reforms is low. Protectionists, in public opinion, almost always outnumber free traders. Protectionists almost always outnumber free traders. This doesn't mean that support for free trade has not increased. According to the best survey that I've seen that was actually given for about 25, 30 years, support for public support for free trade increased a lot. So basically in the mid-'70s, something called the Worldview Survey began asking people whether or not, it was a good question. It basically said, some people think that we should allow products in from other countries because it reduces prices for consumers. Other people think that we need to limit imports from other countries in order to protect American jobs. Right? So it fairly stated both positions in language that the supporters could agree with, and it gave the main argument of each side for their own view. Okay, so in the mid-'70s, only about 80% of Americans said that they sympathize more with the protectionist view and only 20% with the free trade view. Then the survey went on until the early 2000s and pretty much rose consistently during this whole period and peaked out at about 60% protectionist, 40% free trader. And then I think in 2003, the survey stopped being administered. So many people have said that there has been a backsliding in favor of protectionism. I don't know, right? But in this survey, support for free trade peaked at about 40%. Worth pointing out. But pretty much any good survey that has ever been administered has found that Americans are protectionists, often very avid protectionists. The only decent exception that I know of that's gotten much attention and that people have put forward as being a decent survey is one that gave Americans three options. Option number one, I support free trade. Option number two, I do not support free trade. Option number three, I support free trade with worker adjustment programs in order to assist workers who lose their jobs as a result of international competition. Okay. And when you give them these three options, the combined support for the free trade position and the free trade plus worker assistant position exceeds 50%. Okay. Maybe this shows that the whole problem with free traders is that they need to combine their proposals with worker assistance programs. Except there's one thing. We have worker assistance programs already. These programs exist, and people don't support free trade. So that's one thing. The other thing is, notice you have two issues with two options per issue, but you only gave people three choices. Last time I checked, 2 times 2 equals 4. Okay, so if you were administering this question in a reasonably balanced way, you would have had free trade without worker assistance, free trade with worker assistance, no free trade with worker assistance, and no free trade without worker assistance. And I think that alone would probably have tilted the results considerably against free trade. And then, of course, the most obvious elephant in the room here is protectionists don't call their position, I oppose free trade. That isn't the way they describe their view. It's not a fair way in the sense that it's not the way they describe their own view. What does an actual opponent of free trade in the real world call his view to himself and when he tries to defend his view before the public? Fair trade. How about that? Fair trade. All right. You may say, well, it's not really, but it isn't really fair. Well, the protectionists will say it isn't really free because Americans have to compete with people who are working for subsistence wages. All right. So, the reasonable standard for wording questions is to come up with a wording that actual advocates of the position would accept. Okay, so the survey, which was put forward pretty prominently, is showing that Americans would support free trade if only it would be combined with worker assistance programs, probably doesn't hold water. Okay, and that is the best case scenario that I've ever seen for public support for free trade. Okay, how about the minimum wage? See, you probably don't really need to see this because if you ever met a non-economist, non-libertarian who opposed the minimum wage, I'd like to meet him too because I've never found one. Okay, only economists and libertarians oppose the minimum wage, pretty much. Okay, so as far as I know, there's never been a national survey about abolishing the minimum wage for the obvious reason that people know what the result would be. Virtually no one. Okay, how about raising the minimum wage? Well, in 1996, one of the best surveys that was done by Gallup, found that 81% favor raising the minimum wage. So if 81% want to raise it, what percent favor abolishing it? Maybe 1%, 2%, I think would be a reasonable guess. Now, incidentally, and here I will give you a glimmer of hope, That was a survey that was particularly good because half the people were simply asked the question that I gave you. The other half, randomly chosen, were asked a slight variant. The slight variant was, would you favor raising the minimum wage if it would reduce employment of low-skilled workers? That was it. Didn't say drastic reduction, didn't say low-skilled workers will be unemployed for life and will starve to death. It just said if it would reduce employment of low-skilled workers. And just putting on that little hypothetical was enough to reduce public support for raising the minimum wage down to 40%. Okay, so that is one of the more hopeful facts I've ever found because the minimum wage seems to be so part of people's views about what a nice person is. A nice person just favors the minimum wage. Only mean people are against it. And yet it was flexible enough to the facts where you can say, look, if through some strange coincidence of fate, the minimum wage would reduce employment of low-skilled workers. I mean, not that anyone would actually say such a thing, but if it were, per impossible, though impossible, then would you still favor it? And only 40% said yes. So if you could just convince the public that the minimum wage would reduce employment of low-skilled workers, then it looks like the median person would no longer wish to increase it anyway. Okay. Let's look at some other ones. 1996, Gallup also did a survey on legalizing prostitution. 26% favor legalizing prostitution in the United States. Okay, about 1 in 4. Okay, pretty weak. Now, a last one that I was actually going to give you, and then when I was looking into it, I said, wow, I haven't really kept up to date on this. Support for marijuana legalization. All right, I am now here to bring you hope, a little hope. Okay, so here's the thing. Support for marijuana legalization for about 30 years was flat at 25%. Okay, so you might have thought that as the people who smoked pot in the 60s and 70s got older and older, and as their parents who were horrified by their behavior died, that public support would gradually rise. And yet for a long time, it didn't happen. For a long time, support for legalizing marijuana was completely flat at 25%. And then I looked, basically the last time that I looked, maybe 8 years ago at the data, I said, flat for 30 years, even though you would think it would have gone up, probably going to be flat forever. And then when I was writing this talk, I went and looked and said, I was wrong. In about the last 10 years, support for legalizing marijuana has increased to 44%, which is an all-time high for the United States. So it actually looks realistic to think that marijuana might be legalized in the next 10 years. When I put this on my blog, a number of people said, no, it's just a temporary spike and it's going to be back down and it won't happen. All right, so take away the glimmer of hope I was trying to offer you. Why don't you? All right, that may be so. But also worth pointing out, there are, in fact, right now in the United States, there are a number of states where a majority favors legalizing marijuana. And it at least appears that Obama will not try to shut those states down, to overrule those states. So, and once those states do it and we do not have reefer madness in the streets, then perhaps other states may learn from experience, although if you see my talk on Friday, that is a big may. Right? So maybe that it will be an incredible success, and yet there will be a national backlash against it because it's so horrible. Right? How do we know it's so horrible? Well, there was a story on TV about a guy, and it was horrible for him, so therefore, terrible idea. Okay. All right, so support for legalizing marijuana is now at an all-time high of 44%. So in terms of what exactly happened, many people say, people finally realized. Well, then what was happening during the 30 years before? So realizing before. So it's not that easy to explain what happened. One of my colleagues just said, we should credit Harold and Kumar. So, all right, so it is a theory that has not been refuted by the data anyway. Harold and Kumar, so the timing seems about right based upon the movie, so it seems like the movies came out, but why didn't Cheech and Chong do it? Does anyone here remember or ever heard of Cheech and Chong? Yes, so. All right. So, overall, when you look at public opinion, what you see is that the simple median voter model actually works very well. It actually works very well. Okay? And with a few exceptions, as long as you give people at least 3 options, one of which is the status quo, and that seems pretty reasonable, right? Because a lot of people might like the status quo. It's often what people assume is the best thing, right? So what is it? What are we currently doing? All right, let's just stick with that. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay, so as long as you give people at least 3 options on a survey, and one of those options is let's just stick with whatever we got, then the median preference is usually what we have. The median preference usually is what we have. And when the questions are better worded, the correspondence between what we have and what the median person says he wants gets even better. Okay, so for example, for government spending, you might think that it would be reasonable on government spending questions to mention that if government spends less, taxes could be lower. You might argue with that, but it seems like it is reasonable when wording a question to say that, should we increase spending? Should we keep it the same? Should we reduce it? It would seem reasonable to mention if we increase spending, taxes could go up, and if we reduce spending, taxes could go down, or you might even say are likely to. Right? So when you add on that proviso, then the examples I was mentioning where it seems like the median person wants more spending do get weaker. Okay, so maybe even there, if we were to word the questions in a better way, it would turn out that the public doesn't really want more spending on health care. They basically want the status quo. Okay, now the case of 2008 is interesting because you guys may remember the bailouts. You may remember a number of national surveys claiming that the public was up in arms about the bailout and hated it. Right, so, and of course, if you hate the bailout and you have even the liberal media telling you that America hates the bailout, then it's tempting to say, I'm actually in the majority for once. It's good. It feels good for once to be in the majority. Even though government isn't listening to us, at least I'm one of many people who is being ignored, rather than just being a lone nut, as I usually am. Okay, so I spent some time looking into a number of different surveys that were done on the bailout, and it's true that for a few surveys that basically said, do you support President Bush's bailout? For those, then it was common to get a majority saying, no, I do not support his bailout. But there was a better survey that said I think that did a much better job of taking the pulse of America, and it basically said, look, should we do Bush's bailout? Should we do a revised version of the bailout, some other version, or should we just do nothing? Right? And support for doing nothing was quite low, about 25%. So only about 25% of Americans did not want a bailout. And a lot of what the people who opposed the Bush bailout believed was that the bailout didn't go far enough. Right? So for many people who were critical of the bailout, their mental slogan was basically, we shouldn't just bail out Wall Street, we should also bail out Main Street. So wanting perhaps a bigger bailout than was done. Okay, so important to keep in mind. Okay. All right, so now for Obamacare, what I'll say is that according to the questions that I read, and they seem to me to be fairly worded, it really did seem like a majority of Americans opposed Obamacare as a package, although many of the particular parts of Obamacare were very popular, things like banning pre-existing conditions clauses. And I'll also say that Paul Krugman is probably right about how Americans are going to see Obamacare. Okay, so it is common for the American public to oppose government programs until they are imposed, and then very quickly they change their minds. Right? And Krugman said that this happened for Medicare and will happen for Obamacare too. I'm not sure if he was right about Medicare, but I am willing to bet that he's right about Obamacare, and in 5 years Americans will not want to repeal it because now we will take it for granted, and it will seem monstrous to get rid of it. Okay. So when I first started studying public opinion, the question I was always asking myself is, how can government policy be so bad? How is it possible? There's so many policies that seem so stupid and so awful, and yet they exist. Okay. After I studied public opinion, I started asking myself a very different question. And the question was, why isn't policy much worse? Why isn't policy much worse? When you look at the public opinion on free trade versus protection and see how protectionist Americans are and how little protection we have relative to what they want, say, wow, it's almost as if a special interest is thwarting the will of the American people and is ramming free trade down their protectionist throats. Then you think about it a little bit and you say, who are the people who write these free trade treaties? What is their occupation typically? Economists. And what do economists think about free trade? They think it's good. Seems like there is a special interest whose hands are very close to the steering wheel that wants something the public does not want, and lo and behold, the public isn't getting what it wants. It's not proof that, it's not a smoking gun, let's say, that a special interest has overridden the will of the American public, but it's pretty suspicious, right? And say it's also kind of hopeful. Look, there are cases where the public can consistently want a policy that would be quite awful, and yet it has been consistently denied to them. They've never been given what they've asked for, and it seems that one story about this is that economists keep nudging things in a direction the public doesn't want, and since the public is so easily bored with reading a 1,000-page treaty that they just aren't able to get what they're asking for. Now, does this mean that public opinion doesn't matter at all? Because this is actually a common reaction that I've gotten from people saying, look, you've admitted that government sometimes does things that people don't want, therefore public opinion is irrelevant and it's all about interest groups. No. It doesn't mean that politicians can ignore public opinion. What it means is that they may be able to get away with moving somewhat away from public opinion. Right? But notice what has happened during the last 30 years. There was a substantial move to free trade, and also in public opinion there was a substantial move to being less protectionist. Right? So this is actually consistent with a model where, not with a model where the government ignores the public, but where the government listens to the public and then tries to do things a little bit better than the public wants. Actually, to be a little bit more free market and a little bit more libertarian than the public wants. And I say the same thing for civil liberties. If you ever feel like government is taking away your civil liberties, ask yourself, well, what would happen if we listened to the median voter on civil liberties? You might find yourself very grateful for what you have, because the median voter will often want less than what you've got. Okay. So let's see. I think that I will stop there. I'm happy to take questions about anything you've got, and I'm happy to take any questions at all that you might have about public opinion, although please do allow me to admit that I don't know everything that has ever been done, because it is a huge field. So if I don't know, I will say, but if I think I remember the data, I will tell you what I think I remember. And again, if you are writing a paper, don't just cite what I said in this talk, double check, because there's a lot of facts to learn. Yes. Yes.
So I'm wondering about how much public opinion matters in polities that are not democracies. I know you've said something of, Mises sort of famously said that in the democracy or a dictatorship, people sort of get the government they want, or at least the government that they'll tolerate. I was hoping you could expand on, in a dictatorship or a monarchy of some non-democratic quality, how much does public opinion matter?
Yes, so that is a great question. So Ludwig von Mises claims that democracy and dictatorship will give you essentially identical policies. And he has a story about this, is that in a democracy, if people are not happy with the policies they have, they vote their leaders out of office. In a dictatorship, they have a violent revolution. Right? And I kid you not, that is his argument. That would seem to me to be an awful argument for several reasons. First of all, because even if revolution would make your country better off overall, still for you to be the first person to stand up and start shooting is not generally a smart move. See North Korea. Right? Seems very likely that most people in North Korea would like to see a change of government, but it isn't happening. Right? Why? Because the first person who does anything about it dies. Right? And if the first person who moves dies, then people don't do it. Okay, so, as a rule. Okay, so anyway, that seems like a crazy argument to me to say that people violently rebel as soon as a dictator goes away from what they want. Not true, but nevertheless, I think there's a lot of truth in Mises' conclusion. In general, if you look at what I'll call moderate or authoritarian dictatorships, generally when moderate or authoritarian dictatorships give way to democracy, policy does not change that much. Okay. So, for example, if you have a 19th century monarchy in Europe, okay, when they started allowing greater role to democracy, you did not generally see a radical change. You didn't see people voting to take all the property away from the rich or anything like that. There was sometimes you'll see moderate changes, but generally in your authoritarian dictatorships, you don't see a switch to democracy giving you a very large change in policy. Where does dictatorship matter? Basically, it matters for revolutionary totalitarian dictatorships. Okay, so when a small group of crazy men with guns seize control of a country, kill all their enemies, and then propose to shoot the first person who messes around, in those countries you often will see that policies deviate very far from public opinion. Okay, so say farm collectivization in the Soviet Union. 80% of the public in the Soviet Union were small farmers, and I'm pretty sure 80% of the public did not want to have men with guns come and take their land from them and take their animals and kill anyone who resisted. Okay, so dictatorships like that, so revolutionary totalitarian dictatorships that are run by people who are very alienated from their own cultures, or maybe actually don't come from those cultures, often will do things that the public doesn't want. The other ones not so much. I have a paper where I go over a bunch of different mechanisms, but the simplest mechanism is, if you have a monarchy that's been around for a few hundred years, then the people in the royal family are part of that country. They probably think basically like people in that country, and it wouldn't be that surprising if they were to favor the same kinds of policies that normal people in that country favor. Right? On the other hand, if you're part of a revolutionary movement of 20 guys who sat in a basement planning violence, then you might be a little bit outside the mainstream of your country and do something different. So there's a lot more I can say about that, but probably my favorite factoid here is that there was this fantastic study done of public opinion about government and socialism that was done in former West Germany and former East Germany after something like 10 years after unification. And here's what it found. People who came from former East Germany were much more pro-socialist. Right? They were much more socialist if they came from former East Germany, even if they, even controlling for income and other personal circumstances. So it's not just the people from former East Germany were poorer, therefore more socialist. Even if you compared them to a West German who had the same income level, they were more socialist, which suggests to me that brainwashing works. You can grow up in a totalitarian socialist state where they have men with machine guns with walls that kill anyone who tries to flee, and nevertheless, when they tell you that socialism is good, you basically say, well, when they tell you that socialism is fantastic, you say, no, well, it's not fantastic, it's only good. It's only great. The walls and the machine guns are illustrate that it's not quite as fantastic as they're saying, but just divide by 2 and then it's true. And that is the way that people wind up thinking. Half of what people may divide by 2, but still, right? If they grow up in a social society, they probably will be quite socialist. And I'll predict that if the Koreas ever unite, the North Koreans will be the socialist part of Korea. Right? Despite the starvation, despite the horrors. This won't make them say, I don't want to even hear the word socialism or anything that sounds like it or smells like it. I don't want anything that could conceivably be misinterpreted as it. No. They'll be there saying, well, we have to remember the good parts of Kim Jong-ilism. Let's not forget those. Scary but true. Yes?
Do you have any, one thing I'm familiar with public opinion research and this sort of thing is that you have your quantitative and qualitative, like you can survey people, but then you really want to get into it, you focus group of them, helps for developing policy and opinion and that sort of thing. Do you have any comments on, say, like deviations between just a simple survey and other types of public opinion research and how that affects support for libertarianism?
Sure. So, what I'd say is that very often the questions the issues where people seem pretty libertarian, when you go and give them a more detailed, in-depth survey, it turns out they're less libertarian than they seem on the surface. And I would say that's actually is a general pattern, I'm afraid to say. So, for example, if you just look at the basic public opinion on welfare, it seems like this is a winning libertarian issue because it's so unpopular. Again, so unpopular meaning often most people want less. Okay? And yet, when you go and probe them further about what exactly should we do instead, the realistic option of saying, look, eventually you're just going to have to take a low-skilled job and make it in the market economy. That is not the kind of option that normal people want. Focus groups, I'll admit that I know quite a bit less about those. So, I've seen more detailed, in-depth surveys, or I've seen, for example, surveys that do splitting, where if you answer one way, then they give you a different set of questions than if you answer the other way. Focus groups, I know quite a bit less about. Yes, in the front, please.
A lot of your numbers had to do with libertarian. How does it seem, since I was youth, it seemed like everything was conservative, liberal, and now that I'm getting libertarian, it's more that. Is there bias one way or the other when it's going from liberal to conservative over this same time period? Or?
So, would you say, well, what bias?
I just guess I'm thinking just the traditional liberal conservative. Ways, how's the country seem to be moving that way? You said it's not moving our way, but with the other two, what's the trend seem to be?
Okay, sure. So for a very long time, there has been a slight tendency for Americans to say that they're conservative rather than liberal. Right? The word liberal is a bit unpopular, but there's no other word that is less unpopular. So, in terms of the abstract position that people will say that they embrace. Conservatism is more popular than liberalism. Although again, the medium position is just moderate. Medium position is actually just moderate. So that's the way that the median and the modal American sees himself or herself. In terms of issue positions, what I'd say is on social issues, there's probably been some movement in a more liberal direction. And on economic issues, until fairly recently, I think there's been some moderate move in a more conservative direction. So, and if you just think about libertarianism as being socially liberal and economically conservative, then that sounds like a pretty good trend, right? But I will say it's fairly small. Something else worth pointing out, the Cato Institute has done a number of studies on libertarianism in the general public, where, of course, you can begin by asking the question of, are you libertarian? And for that, you'll have a very small fraction of the public will say yes, obviously. If the kinds of questions that give you the highest response rate for being libertarians, if you just ask people, are you socially liberal and economically conservative, there you actually get a pretty decent chunk of the public saying it. I think it's a bit less than 25%, so it's a little bit less than you get by chance, but still, fairly decent amount. However, and then Cato has done a lot of research on who exactly are these people, what are they like. Okay, so all very interesting. But when I was talking to David Bose, who's been involved in all this, I said, well, what about the other quadrant? What about the socially conservative, economically liberal quadrant? Is anyone studying them or finding out about them? And he's saying, and I don't remember what he said, but to put my words into his mouth, saying, well, no, fortunately, people are not studying them very, very intently. And you might say, well, maybe we should study them in order to change their minds, whatever, but it's probably going to be pretty hard. And now, by the way, to give you one other ray of hope, and this is a ray of hope that you may actually reject, but I will push it upon you. Ray of hope. More educated people are more libertarian. More educated people are more libertarian, which I have had many economics professors say that's completely absurd. Right? Why is it completely absurd? Look, I've talked to people in the sociology department, and they're basically communists. And say, let's go back to that point I was making on that Nixon 72 election. Yes, there's something a little bit odd about asking university professors of other departments in order to figure out what regular Americans think. There's a few ways in which the typical university professor is different than the typical American. Can you think of the most obvious one? It's the most obvious difference between, let's say the second most obvious one. The most obvious one is they're more educated than the general public. Second most obvious difference between academics and general public? Well, let's see. A lot of us don't have tenure. I do now, yeah. But I'd say the most obvious difference is they're left-wing. They're not just a little left-wing, they're really left-wing. Okay, so when you go and look at highly educated people in universities, basically what you're seeing there are the people who are very left-wing and who decide they never want to leave. Right? So they go to college, they say, hey, this is great, it's really left-wing here, and then they stay. And that is a pretty decent approximation of what the typical professor is like. However, most people who get an education don't stay in college forever. They don't make it into their job. They move out into the real world, and when you do a nationally representative survey of educated people, or rather a nationally representative survey of people, and then compare the views of more educated to less educated, what you see is definitely that more educated people are more pro-market, and they're also more in favor of civil liberties. Now, finally, you may say, but even when I go and talk to non-academic people who are highly educated, they still don't seem very libertarian. Notice I said more libertarian, not libertarian. Big difference. More libertarian than what? More libertarian than high school graduates, more libertarian than high school dropouts. And if you say, oh, can that really be? Well, how many high school graduates or high school dropouts do you talk to about politics or economics? Doesn't happen very often. When you do ask them, you may be horrified. Yes. They are the people who are most likely to say things like we should start shooting illegal immigrants for fleeing over the border and that kind of stuff. Yes, and nuke them all, God will know his own. Right? These are the kinds of attitudes that you see that are common among the less educated. More educated people are more likely to fall back from that and say, whoa, we don't have to really nuke people. That seems unwise, maybe excessive, so on. So this is what you can get. So again, this does not mean that the more educated are more libertarian, or they are libertarian, but does mean that they are more libertarian. And incidentally, this gives us a partial explanation, perhaps, for why policy seems to be more libertarian than the median person wants, which is that more educated people are more likely to vote. So if you see politicians in a debate and you think, wow, they're just catering to the lowest common denominator, no, they're not. They're actually catering to an elite self-selected group of people who vote. Not that elite, but a little bit elite. And if everybody voted, they would the debates that currently seem to be insufferably dumbed down, you would learn what dumbed down really is. It can get a lot worse than it is, and would if politicians were worried about the opinion of everyone rather than the opinion of everybody who voted. Let's see. I think there's questions over here. Let's see. Questions in the back. Okay, how about? Sure.
Given all this, what do you think is to be said about various calls for restricting or putting restrictions on voting, like a certain education requirement or property ownership requirement, things like that?
Very good question. Yes, I have one paragraph on this in The Myth of the Rational Voter, and I was asked about it on like 15 radio shows. So it's the highest ratio of questions per paragraph in the in the entire book. Here's what I say: if it were to be done, I think it would improve. I think it would improve policy, and I would support it absolutely. Yes. Yes. So, what do I think about restrictions upon voting? If it were to be done, I think it would improve policy. However, it is so unlikely to be done that I don't see much purpose in trying to push it, because it would be easier to convince people to abolish the minimum wage than to convince them to restrict the franchise. Right? So, if you were so persuasive that you could persuade people to say that you have to pass a test in order to vote, if you're that persuasive, you can persuade people of a whole lot of other stuff first. So, you probably don't even need to bother with this. But I think it would be a good idea if tried, right? And what I would say, and I think this is feasible, is we should discourage get-out-the-vote campaigns. Voter turnout should not be encouraged. Should be discouraged. Because if we had 100% turnout, then politicians would indeed have to cater to the median person rather than the median voter that we currently have, and which would mean that the education level of a typical voter would fall, and the quality of their views on policy would fall as well. So I think it is bad. I think it is bad, but not only bad, bad to encourage voting, but it is actually doable to at least quietly discourage or be unsupportive of get-out-the-vote campaigns. I think that they do tend to make things worse. In my book, I point out that Great Britain until 1949 actually did have plural voting for college graduates and people who owned a business in a district other than the one of the residents. So you ever heard things like in the 1930s the number of democracies on Earth was down to like 7 or 9? Well, one of those democracies, so-called, gave 2 votes to college graduates. Okay, and that was Great Britain. So this was changed in 1949, but it is actually in living memory that a country that was seen as democratic by everyone actually did this. So, and I think that would tend to push policy in a somewhat better direction. Yes, let's see. Actually, someone who hasn't asked a question yet already. Let's see, was there a question in the back? Let's see. All right, second question.
So, sort of on a similar topic, I remember. So it's my question is about men and women and expanding the franchise to women. A lot of people say that was bad for libertarian policy. Is that borne out? Was restricting, expanding the franchise to women bad for libertarian policy?
Do you want the truth?
Yeah.
Yes, the truth is that women are less libertarian and think less like economists on virtually every question I've ever seen. Right? That is now to be specific, what this means is that there are many questions where they are less libertarian, think less like economists, and there are virtually no questions where they are more libertarian or think more like economists. Okay, so that is the data. Okay, so I'm just a messenger, so don't kill me for this. I was actually at a debate on paternalism once, and after the talk, some people were saying, "But aren't women really more paternalistic than men?" And I was saying, that's an interesting hypothesis, in which case it would suggest that the name paternalism is pretty unfair. It should really be called maternalism, perhaps. So I went straight home to the General Social Survey and looked at all the questions I could find that were relevant to paternalism. And here's what I found. So marijuana legalization, I believe women were less supportive of marijuana legalization. Women were less supportive of the right to suicide. Right, and let's see, I'm trying to remember. I think there were 1 or 2 other questions relevant to paternalism, where at least there were no questions where women were less paternalistic, and I think on like 3 out of 4, maybe all 4, women were more paternalistic. Now, of course, don't exaggerate this. It is a marginal difference. So almost everyone's paternalistic, but it looks like women are a bit more paternalistic. And in terms of economics, women are less supportive of free market policies. And in general, in terms of economic thinking, women do think less like economists. So I have a whole paper on this called The Gender Gap of Economics, where I try to account for this. My story is actually pretty complicated, so I think that I will save it for conversation or Q&A. Actually, this is Q&A. I'll save it for conversation if you're curious about it. But those are the facts. Now, incidentally, so you may say, is this just my view? Well, if you go over to political science, it is also known that women score lower on tests of political knowledge than men. So I actually went and know one of the most prominent researchers in this area, who's a guy named Scott Keeter, who used to be the chair of the Public International Affairs Department at George Mason. He's someone with no libertarian or free market sympathies. So but a very, very good, thoughtful guy. And I actually asked him, so off the record, Scott. And I said, maybe I shouldn't. Well, yeah, I don't remember saying off the record. So I just so were you tempted to suppress your findings on women? And he said, Yes, but I just tried to present it in a very amiable, fair, friendly light, and he got away with it. Okay, but even he was worried, so worth pointing out. Let's see, other questions? See, I think we have a little bit more time, don't we? Let's see, how much more time do we have? Let's see. We're actually, are we just about out of time? Or let's see. We have 15 minutes. So I'm happy to keep going. Actually, yes. I can go on this for a very long time. Yes.
I want to know if you knew anything about public opinion in places like Singapore and Hong Kong, where there aren't any democracies.
Great question. Yes, I have a whole piece on public opinion in Singapore for the Civil Service Journal of Singapore, Ethos. So I'm popular in Singapore. I don't think it's bad to be popular anywhere. So here's what you can say about public opinion in Singapore. Overall, it does not look like they. So we can just step back. Singapore has a lot of policies that economists would say are efficient that almost no other country on earth has. For example, Singapore has a very developed system of road congestion pricing. Okay, what this means is that you can drive around in Singapore at rush hour in a major city at the speed limit. Where else on earth can you do that? Very unusual. This is something that economists have been saying is a good idea for years. Singapore has it. Let's see, other examples. Singapore has a healthcare system that I think Michael Tanner would be very happy with. Is he here? I'm not sure. So, again, it is not laissez-faire by any means. It is not a full free market, but it is a system where people pay a fairly high fraction of their healthcare costs and where competition is preserved. It's also one where government subsidies are extremely limited, where basically if there's a person who has a major healthcare problem and they say they can't pay, the government first says, you sure you can't pay? Let's take a look at your income, let's take a look at your wealth, let's take a look at assets, and then they look at that and they say, how about you got any kids? Because if you got any kids, we're going to make them pay. Really? Yes. In Singapore, the government turns to your kids before taxpayers, which, as a libertarian, I think is unfair, but still probably less unfair than going to total strangers. Right? These people gave you life, so it's certainly not as obvious that you shouldn't be financially liable for them than for a total stranger who doesn't know you anything, you think. Okay, let's see. There's many other examples where Singapore has policies that that it would be considered that would be unpopular over the world, and yet Singapore has them. So Singapore is basically complete free trade. Another thing, Singapore lets in a lot of immigrants. Okay, so now how is this possible? How is it possible that Singapore has all these unpopular policies? The most popular theory is that Singapore is a dictatorship. Okay, so that was actually my view before I learned anything about this. But when I actually started studying the politics and history of Singapore, I realized it's just not true. Singapore is a democracy. Right? International organizations, international human rights organizations, election monitors will attest that Singaporean elections are free and fair. Okay, there are a few electoral rules that some people might question, but basically, it is legal to be in the opposition. Opposition candidates do not fear for their lives by any means, and voters can vote for them without fear of consequences. Okay, and yet the same party, the People's Action Party, has won almost all the seats for the last 40 years. Right? That, as far as I understand the definition of democracy, is democracy. Right? There are free elections. The same party keeps winning. Right? Now how exactly is that undemocratic? Right? Again, there are some complexity here, but the popular story that most people in the West would tell is that Singapore is a dictatorship. This is how they managed to have all these great policies. That's false. So what's really going on? So that led me to study Singaporean public opinion. There have been a couple of surveys that have been done in some Asian countries. And in general, what you see is that Singaporeans are not especially supportive of other countries' policies. Right, so Singaporeans, for example, are not pro-immigration. Singaporeans, we would like to have less immigration. The median person in Singapore does favor free trade, though. Okay, so but still, it is not overwhelming support by any means. Right, the median person supports it, but nevertheless, it is not like 80 or 90%. It's not like the 98% of Americans who think that the right to speak freely is essential or important, anything like that. And then, just to begin with the example I started with, congestion pricing is incredibly unpopular in Singapore. They hate it, but they've got it. Okay, so if it's a democracy and these policies are unpopular, how do they do it? Right, so this was an interesting question for me. He's like, maybe democracy could sustain much better policies despite public opinion. What it seems that you see in Singaporean public opinion is that despite their policy views, they are genuinely very deferential. And they do have a very strong attitude of the People's Action Party has brought Singapore from an impoverished third world country to the richest country on earth. And just because we are not too happy with the few things they're doing, we probably don't want to go and throw it over to a bunch of other bozos. Right? And that is how they see the other parties in Singapore. Okay, so have you ever heard someone in America who says, I'm not going to vote for a third party because you're just throwing your vote away? In Singapore, they basically say that about, I won't vote for a second party because you're just throwing your vote away. They won't win anyway, and they're just a bunch of weird losers, so I don't want anything to do with them. Right? So that's the other thing, is that pretty much almost anyone who is competent and successful and wants to get into politics goes with the People's Action Party, and the remaining people in Singapore just go with these small loser parties, and people don't want to go with them because they just don't respect them. Okay, so that seems to be what's going on in Singapore. It is an interesting case, and probably should be studied more. And this will give you an idea about what's amazing to me about Singapore is that I write these things about Singapore, and the government publishes it in their own journal. Right? It's like, I'm saying stuff about you that most people regard as fairly unflattering, and yet they're saying, "Oh, how interesting." So this is and I've been quoted by their law minister at international conferences, and so on. I'm just baffled that there could be a country where politicians would quote me in public, saying what I actually think. Right? So I got to say that's So is Singapore utopia, libertarian paradise? Far from it. They have a number of horrifying policies. Yes, when you go and enter into Singapore, there is on the customs form in capital letters, death for drugs in Singapore. It's like, all right, well, good thing I don't have any drugs then. Or I raise my hand and say, before we enter Singapore, is there something that I could do about the narcotics that I happen to be carrying, not understanding the laws of your country? So, although, I will say, personally, since I don't use drugs, that would not make me afraid to live in Singapore. The policy that I actually went and told them was truly awful, and I said, this is why your country is actually worse, your policies are worse than the ones in the United States, despite all your other great things. You have conscription. And they laughed in my face. I say, look, you were slaves. Right? You had to go and do a job you didn't want to do for 2 years, and that's terrible. And they just laughed. And I said, well, then you're happy slaves. Sorry. You're just wrong. It is terrible. And so that is what they have. It's one other amazing policy that Singapore is close to adopting, and that was, originally I heard they were going to have a free market in human organs. Turned out that was a bit oversold. What they're going to do is have financial compensation for human organs. Okay, so they're not actually willing to have a market. There's only one country so enlightened as to have a free market in human organs. Yeah, Iran, yes. The enlightened country of Iran is the only one that is willing to actually do this. So, yay, Iran. Right? Okay, so let's see. I think I got at least time for one or two more questions. Yes, up in the front.
Public opinion generally is relatively slow to change, I imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any studies or information on how quickly it changes in, perceived crisis scenarios?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I guess the BP oil spill that's so bad, is there a significant shift in environmental opinion and for more significant crisis?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the very best example that I have of this is what is called the rally around the flag effect. So basically what you'll see is that the act of declaring war makes war more popular, a lot more popular. Okay, so actually the rally around the flag effect for Iraq is the largest one ever recorded. In the course of maybe a month, public support for invading Iraq increased by 30 percentage points. Okay, so that is very large. And this is a general pattern. Pretty much any time that virtually any country that has public opinion data gets into a war, support for that war will immediately increase by a lot, and then will gradually decline, even if the war goes as well as could reasonably be expected. Okay, so now that's probably the best studied example. There's a public opinion guy named Scott Aldhouse who is now writing a book on public opinion in war, which I think is going to be excellent. So this is where you can get a lot of evidence on this. For other crises, I think there is some work on them, but the problem is that in the middle of a sudden economic crisis, very often the questions that people are asked are fairly poorly worded. So like, public opinion on the bailout. Most of the survey questions there were very poorly worded, where they basically would just say people like, do you want to do the exact bailout that's being done or not? Right, which made it look like people just wanted to go and do nothing about it. So made it look like the libertarian position was overwhelmingly popular, but in fact was not. Excuse me. Let's see. In terms of other rapid swings in public opinion, let's see. The only other one that comes to mind is that public opinion on civil rights in the South changed fairly rapidly after the adoption of civil rights laws, although it was pointed out to me it was also changing quite rapidly in the decades before. So as to whether this is really a case where changing the law changed people's minds, or whether the law simply reflected an ongoing change in people's minds, hard to say. Let's see. Yes?
You comment on the validity of the median voter model in democracies that have proportional representation rather than having a system.
Sure. So in terms of the basic theory of the median voter model, it only, strictly speaking, works when you have two parties or two candidates. Right? And yet, I will still say that when you go and just take a look at the median position in public opinion in countries and compare it to their policies, usually there's a pretty good match. So the suggestion is that the median voter model seems to work pretty well, even when, strictly speaking, it shouldn't. And if you think about the United States, actually, strictly speaking, the median voter model shouldn't even work for the United States, because while there's two parties, there's three branches of government. And the actual procedure for policy making is quite a bit more complicated than if something has the support of the median voter, then it happens. And yet there seems to be a very good match between what the median person wants and what we actually get. So in terms of what's really going on here, there's a lot of different mechanisms that you could tell. One of them is that while it appears that we have three different branches, all of them actually are very worried about public opinion. Right? So to take the example of the Supreme Court, which seems to be most insulated from public opinion, yet there has been at least some decent work done showing that the Supreme Court in practice appears to pay attention to public opinion and to change its rulings when public opinion changes. Now, you may say, how is that possible? Because the Constitution doesn't change when public opinion changes. Right? Yeah. The constitutions are interpreted by men. Now a few women. Right? They are interpreted by human beings, and if 9 human beings decide that it means something different, or actually 5 human beings decide that it means something different, then that something different becomes the law of the land. Incidentally, when I talk about public opinion and democracy, very often, from libertarians, I get the objection, look, you're so wrong because America is a republic, not a democracy. I say, yes, in theory, it's a republic, not a democracy. In practice, though, if most people want something, how often does our government keep saying no to them? Right, so in practice, we are much closer to democracy than you might like. Saying that the original deal is republic is true, but doesn't change the fact that's not how the system generally works in practice. In practice, if there is a constitutional restriction that's stopping most people from getting what they want, we usually find some way around it. Right? And by we, I mean they, actually, because it's usually them doing it to me. Now, by the way, my colleague Pete Betke, I've been talking to him about this for many years, and he often repeatedly said to me, "Look, Bryan, so according to you, we get the government that we deserve." And I say, well, really, what it is that we, namely me and Pete, get the government they deserve, and unfortunately, we have to suffer under it, even though we are not part of they. So it's not saying that you and I are personally responsible for this, but rather saying that the policies that exist are popular. Right? So in some sense, you could say that there's a rough justice in letting the majority suffer under the policies that they've imposed upon themselves. But what about the minority that didn't want those policies? Right? What about them? Right? So my colleague Tyler Cowen often goes and says, "Look, Sweden is a perfectly fine country. May not be libertarian, but they don't want to be libertarian." And I always say, "Yes. Well, who's the they?" I agree that a large majority of the people who are in Sweden do support their policies, but I'm concerned about the minority of Swedes who are oppressed. Yes, and again, in Sweden they laughed at me when I said, "Look, you are oppressing your rich people in this country, and it's wrong." And I'm serious. And they just couldn't believe me. They said, "Look, you are oppressing people who have entrepreneurial ambitions. You are oppressing people whose main goal in life is to get rich, and you should stop doing it." Right? And they say, "What? How can that be?" I say, "Look, you are familiar with the concept of oppressed minorities. This is a oppressed minority that you aren't interested in, but you should be." So that's where I'll stop.